The thunderous roar of military helicopters shattered the dawn silence as they descended upon Earl Whitaker's modest farmland. 6 Black Hawks, their rotors whipping corn stalks into a frenzy, surrounded the weathered farmhouse. Dozens of armed Air Force personnel poured out, weapons raised, moving with practiced precision toward the old barn where Earl stood frozen, pitchfork in hand. "Secure the perimeter," bellowed a commander through a megaphone. "Mr. Whitaker, we know he's here. Come out with your hands visible." Earl's weathered face remained impassive as he watched the soldiers encircle his property. Behind him, hidden beneath hay bales and old farm equipment, lay a wounded man in a flight suit, the pilot he'd pulled from burning wreckage just yesterday. The insignia on the man's uniform wasn't American. "You have exactly 60 seconds to comply before we enter by force." The countdown had begun, and Earl Whitaker had a decision to make that would change everything. 24 hours earlier, Earl had been walking his property line at dusk, checking fences as he'd done every evening for 43 years. The family farm in rural Nebraska had been struggling for the past decade, debt mounting, equipment failing, and the unrelenting drought making each harvest more desperate than the last. At 68, the land was all he had left after Margaret's passing. His arthritic hands traced the rusted wire of the fence when the sky erupted. The sound hit him first, a high-pitched scream of failing engines, then the sight, a sleek aircraft plummeting from the clouds, trailing black smoke against the crimson sunset. Earl didn't think, he ran. Decades melted away as his boots pounded across the dry earth toward the impact site just beyond his north field. The ground shook when the plane struck, a fireball erupting into the darkening sky. The heat was intense, debris scattered across hundreds of yards. Earl pulled his coat over his face, approaching the mangled cockpit where flames licked at twisted metal. That's when he saw the movement, a hand weakly reaching. "Hold on!" Earl shouted, searching frantically for an opening. The canopy was partially shattered. With strength he hadn't summoned in years, Earl pulled at the frame, ignoring the searing pain as metal burned his palms. Inside, a pilot hung limply in his harness, blood streaming from beneath his helmet. Earl reached in, knife from his pocket already cutting through the straps. The man's eyes flickered open momentarily, disoriented, pained before closing again. With a final heave, Earl pulled the unconscious pilot free, dragging him away from the wreckage seconds before secondary explosions sent shrapnel flying in all directions. Earl covered the man's body with his own, feeling sharp metal slice through his jacket. When the air cleared, Earl examined the stranger. The flight suit was unlike any American military uniform he recognized, the patches and insignia foreign. The man's breathing was shallow, a nasty gash across his torso seeping blood. Earl made his choice then, hoisting the pilot onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry. No time to call authorities, not with the man bleeding out. The farmhouse was a mile away, and Earl began the long walk back, each step deliberate despite his burden. "You hang on, son," he grunted, pressing forward as distant sirens began to wail somewhere beyond his property. "Just hang on." The kitchen table became an impromptu operating room. Earl's hands trembled as he cleaned the worst of the wounds, applying pressure bandages from the ancient first aid kit Margaret had insisted on keeping stocked. The pilot remained unconscious, his breathing ragged but persistent. Earl worked methodically, skills from his Vietnam medic days returning with muscle memory he tried to forget. As he cut away the flight suit, something fell to the floor, a small metal object that looked like a flash drive, but more complex, with strange markings etched into its surface. He pocketed it without thinking, focusing instead on the man's injuries. Hours passed as Earl monitored his patient, changing bandages and forcing water between cracked lips whenever consciousness briefly returned. During one such moment, the pilot's eyes flew open, dark, alert eyes that fixed on Earl with sudden clarity. Where am I? The accent was slight but noticeable. My farm. You crashed about a mile north of here. The pilot tried to sit up, grimacing in pain. They'll be looking for me. You need to rest now. Nobody's coming tonight with that storm moving in. Earl nodded toward the window where rain had begun lashing against the glass. You don't understand. The man gripped Earl's wrist with surprising strength. What I was carrying, it's important. Did you find anything with me? A small device. The weight of the object in Earl's pocket suddenly felt heavier. Who are you? The pilot swallowed hard. Lieutenant Alexei Petrov, and I wasn't supposed to be in your airspace. Earl's blood ran cold as realization dawned. Russian. It's not what you think, Petrov insisted, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'm defecting. What I have could prevent something terrible. Before Earl could respond, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. A vehicle was coming up the long driveway. That'll be Sheriff Dawson, Earl said, moving to the window. I need to tell him. No, Petrov's panic was palpable. If my presence becomes official, people will die, including you. The approaching vehicle wasn't the sheriff's cruiser. It was an unmarked black SUV, moving slowly, searchlights scanning the property. Earl made a split-second decision. Can you move? Petrov nodded grimly. Then we've got about 2 minutes to get you to the cellar. The SUV departed after 30 tense minutes, during which 2 men in suits inspected the distant crash site but didn't approach the house. Earl watched from the darkened window, shotgun ready across his lap, until their taillights disappeared down the rural road. In the cellar, Petrov sat propped against a wall of preserved vegetables, his face ashen but determined. They're just the first. More will come by morning, official channels. What exactly did you take, Lieutenant? Earl asked, placing the strange device on a crate between them. Petrov eyed it with both relief and apprehension. The final piece of Project Blacklight, a quantum encryption key. It contains the activation codes for an orbital weapons system my government has been developing in secret. Earl's expression remained neutral, decades of poker games serving him well. And why are you defecting with it? Because the hardliners are planning a first strike, not just a defensive capability. This key is one of only 3 in existence. Without all 3, the system remains dormant. Petrov's eyes held Earl steadily. I was the test pilot for the delivery system. When I learned the true purpose, I couldn't be part of it. Why should I believe you? You shouldn't, Petrov answered simply. But in approximately 12 hours, this farm will be swarming with both American and Russian operatives. The Americans will want the key, and the Russians will want to ensure I haven't talked. Earl considered the stranger before him, a wounded enemy on American soil, by his own admission carrying stolen military technology. By all reason and patriotism, he should be reaching for his phone, calling authorities. Instead, he found himself asking, what will happen if you deliver this key to our people? Best case, international incident, diplomatic crisis. Worst case, your government reverse engineers the technology, creates their own version. Petrov coughed, wincing. The problem isn't who has the weapon, Mr. Whitaker, Earl Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, the problem is the weapon existing at all. Outside, the storm intensified, rain hammering the farmhouse like 1,000 impatient fingers. Earl rubbed his knee absently, an old war injury aching with the weather change. You were military, Petrov observed. Army, Medical Corps, Vietnam. Then you understand what I'm saying. Earl stood with a grunt. I understand you need rest. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. But morning was still hours away when Earl was startled awake by a sound he'd hoped never to hear again, the distinctive whine of surveillance drones. He moved to the window, peering through the blinds at 3 small aircraft hovering at the edges of his property, their red lights blinking in the pre-dawn darkness. They work fast, came Petrov's voice from the doorway. He'd managed to climb the cellar stairs, leaning heavily against the frame. "Who are they?" Could be either side at this point. Petrov hobbled to the window. "But they're just the scouts. The real force won't be far behind." Earl's mind raced through options, none of them good. "My truck's in the barn if we move now. They'll have thermal imaging. They'll see us the moment we step outside." Petrov shook his head. "There's another way, but you won't like it." "I already don't like any of this. The key needs to be destroyed, not delivered to either side." Earl's eyebrows shot up. "And how exactly do we do that?" "With fire. Intense heat will melt the internal components beyond recovery." Petrov's gaze was unflinching. "But we need to make them believe it's still intact, create a diversion." Dawn was breaking when they finished preparations. Earl changed Petrov's bandages one last time, nodding with approval that the bleeding had mostly stopped. The Russian was weak but mobile. "This plan of yours is suicide," Earl said flatly, loading shells into his shotgun. "Not with the right distraction." Petrov held up a small device Earl recognized from his military days, a signal jammer, modified from pieces of the farm's old radio equipment. "This will buy us 4 minutes of confusion, maybe 5. Enough time to reach the North Ridge through the irrigation tunnels." Earl nodded toward the kitchen stove where the real encryption key was hidden inside an old coffee can, ready for destruction. The decoy, fashioned from similar-looking farm equipment parts, was in Petrov's pocket. "And you're sure destroying this thing prevents the weapon from ever being used?" "Without this specific key, the system is useless. They'd have to start from scratch, and by then I will have exposed the entire project." The distant sound of helicopter rotors grew steadily louder. "It's time," Petrov said. Earl took one last look around the kitchen where he and Margaret had spent 40 years of mornings together. Photos on the refrigerator. Their son Michael, who never returned from Afghanistan, holidays long past, the farm in better days. "If we get separated," Earl said, "the meeting point is the lightning-struck oak at Carson's Creek." Petrov nodded, understanding that the old farmer was offering a contingency he didn't expect to use. They both knew the odds. Earl's gnarled hand extended, and Petrov clasped it firmly. "Ready?" Earl asked. "Duh." Which brings us back to the present. Earl standing in his barn doorway, watching Air Force personnel encircle his property, the wounded Russian pilot hidden just feet away, the countdown approaching 0. 30 seconds, Mr. Whitaker. Earl stepped forward, hands raised. "Hold your fire, I'm coming out." The commanding officer approached, flanked by armed soldiers. "Earl Whitaker, I'm Colonel James Herrick, United States Air Force Special Operations. Where is he?" "The pilot, gone, left during the night." Herrick's expression hardened. "My men have this entire property surrounded. Nothing leaves without us seeing it." "With all due respect, Colonel, your men just got here. The pilot left hours ago." The colonel signaled, and soldiers rushed the barn, emerging moments later shaking their heads. Earl maintained his composure despite the triumph surging through him. The hidden compartment beneath the hay storage, built during Prohibition by his grandfather, had held. "Mr. Whitaker, this is a matter of national security. That pilot was carrying classified technology stolen from a research facility. Harboring him is treason." "Funny," Earl replied. "He said he was Russian." A flicker of something crossed Herrick's face, surprise perhaps or concern. "That's classified information." "Not when the man tells you himself while you're digging shrapnel out of his shoulder." Earl narrowed his eyes. "What's really going on here, Colonel?" Before Herrick could answer, a new commotion erupted at the perimeter. A second convoy of vehicles approached, black SUVs with government plates, led by a silver sedan. "Who authorized Langley?" Herrick muttered, then turned to his communications officer. "Get me confirmation on NSA involvement." The CIA had arrived, and judging by the colonel's reaction, this wasn't coordinated. Earl suppressed a smile as the first phase of Petrov's plan unfolded, agencies tripping over each other, creating confusion. A distinguished man in a tailored suit emerged from the sedan, flanked by agents with the unmistakable earpieces and vigilant eyes of CIA personnel. "Colonel Herrick," the man addressed coolly, "I'm Deputy Director Warner. Your presence here is no longer required." "With respect, sir, this is an Air Force operation. We have jurisdiction over the downed aircraft and its pilot." "That changed at 600 when the President signed this." Warner handed over a document. "The technology the defector carried falls under our purview now." While the agencies postured, Earl noticed something alarming: a third group taking positions in the tree line beyond his east field. These weren't Americans. Their movements were too disciplined, too methodical. Russians. Exactly as Petrov had predicted. Earl caught a glimpse of his watch. 3 minutes until the signal jammer activated, precisely when the morning train would pass the western edge of his property. Timing would be everything. "Mr. Whitaker," Warner approached, voice smooth as silk, "we know Lieutenant Petrov contacted you. We know he entrusted you with something. Cooperating now ensures your safety and the security of our nation." Earl studied the man's face, recognizing the practiced sincerity of someone who'd built a career on elegant deception. "I told the Air Force boys, and I'll tell you, he left during the night." Warner's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The nearest town is 17 miles away. A wounded man couldn't make that journey on foot." "Who said anything about on foot? I gave him my truck." This new information sent agents scrambling to relay commands. Warner's composure slipped momentarily. "You expect me to believe you gave your only vehicle to a foreign operative?" "No, sir. I expect you to believe I gave a ride to a dying man who saved my grandson overseas." The lie came easily. "Michael's tags are still in my bedroom drawer if you want to see them." The mention of a military connection created the perfect moment of hesitation. Nobody wanted to be the government agent harassing a veteran's family with a personal debt to pay. 2 minutes to activation. Warner recovered quickly. "Be that as it may, we have reason to believe Petrov left something in your care, a small device, approximately the size of a cigarette lighter." Earl allowed confusion to show on his face. He had something like that, kept it close, figured it was important. "Where is it now?" "Like I said, he took it when he left." Warner's patience visibly thinned. "Mr. Whitaker, perhaps I wasn't clear. That device contains information that could compromise the safety of millions. If you're withholding—" The distant train whistle sounded right on schedule. 1 minute. "Sir," a junior agent approached urgently. Thermal imaging showing multiple contacts in the woods east of the property, moving in tactical formation. Warner's attention shifted immediately. "How many?" "At least 12, sir, not ours." The farm had become a convergence point for 3 separate forces, exactly the chaotic scenario Petrov had predicted. American military, American intelligence, and Russian operatives, all focused on Earl Whitaker's modest Nebraska farm and the secret it supposedly held. 30 seconds. "Colonel," Warner barked, "secure the perimeter against these new contacts. Mr. Whitaker comes with me." "Sir," Earl interjected with practiced rural innocence, "my insulin is in the kitchen. Need my morning dose." Warner hesitated, then nodded to an agent. "Escort Mr. Whitaker. Don't let him out of your sight." 15 seconds. As they moved toward the farmhouse, Earl spotted the shadow of movement beneath the barn door. Petrov was ready. The kitchen was exactly as they'd left it, the coffee can sitting innocuously on the counter beside the stove. 10 seconds. "My medication's in the refrigerator," Earl directed the agent, positioning himself between the man and the stove. With practiced movements, He opened the fridge door wide enough to block the agent's view. 5 seconds. Earl reached for the insulin case with his left hand. With his right, he turned the stove burner to high. 0. The signal jammer activated precisely as the train passed, its electromagnetic field amplified by the metal cars. Every electronic device within half a mile went dead simultaneously: radios, phones, surveillance equipment. In the same instant, the coffee can containing the real encryption key began to melt, the specialized thermite mixture inside reaching temperatures hot enough to destroy the quantum components beyond recovery. Pandemonium erupted outside as communications failed. The escorting agent rushed to the window, momentarily forgetting Earl, who used the opportunity to slip the decoy device into his pocket. Through the window, Earl watched as the hidden Russians made their move, emerging from cover to engage the Americans. Gunfire erupted across his east field, bullets tearing through ripening corn stalks. "Get down!" The agent shoved Earl to the floor as bullets shattered the kitchen window. In the chaos, no one noticed the slight figure emerging from beneath the barn, using the firefight as cover to slip into the irrigation tunnels that would lead to the North Ridge and freedom. Earl allowed himself to be evacuated to an armored vehicle as the farm became a battlefield. Russian operatives clashed with American forces, while the CIA attempted to secure what they believed was their primary objective: the farmer who knew where the encryption key was hidden. "I need you to be absolutely straight with me now," Warner said once they were inside the vehicle speeding away from the property. "Where is the device Petrov gave you?" Earl reached slowly into his pocket, producing the decoy with just the right amount of reluctance. "I was afraid if I turned it over, they'd kill me regardless." Warner examined the device, relief evident in his expression. "You've done your country a service today, Mr. Whitaker. What happens now?" "Now we get you somewhere safe, until this situation is contained." As the vehicle carried him away from the farm that had been his entire life, Earl watched smoke rising from his fields, where the three forces continued to clash. The real encryption key was melting into unrecognizable slag on his kitchen stove. Petrov would be reaching the ridge by now, where a predetermined escape route awaited. And in Earl's breast pocket, close to his heart, rested the one thing neither the Americans nor Russians knew about: Petrov's handwritten testimony detailing Project Blacklight, names, locations, and technical specifications, all on microfilm small enough to hide inside a Vietnam-era Zippo lighter that had never left Earl's possession in 50 years. The farm grew smaller in the distance, and Earl allowed himself a moment of grief for the life he was leaving behind. But some sacrifices were worth making. His son Michael had died trying to protect innocent lives in a war that had no clear purpose. Perhaps, in this unexpected final chapter of his life, Earl could succeed where his son had been denied the chance. The vehicle turned onto the highway, carrying Earl Whitaker and secrets that could change the balance of global power toward an uncertain future, while behind him, the weapon that could have tilted that balance burned away into nothing on an old stove in a Nebraska farmhouse. The greatest victories, Earl reflected, were sometimes the ones the world would never know about. The CIA safe house was nothing like Earl had imagined. No underground bunker or fortified compound, just a modest suburban home in Omaha with beige siding and unremarkable furniture. The kind of place designed to disappear in plain sight. Earl sat at a kitchen table that reminded him of a cheap imitation of his own, now likely destroyed in the crossfire back at the farm. Across from him, Deputy Director Warner studied the decoy device with mounting frustration. "It's not working," Warner said finally, setting down the small object. "The authentication protocols aren't responding." Earl maintained his practiced look of rural confusion. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Warner's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Whitaker, let me be absolutely clear. The only reason you're sitting in this safe house rather than an interrogation room is your cooperation thus far. That goodwill has limits." A technician entered, whispered something in Warner's ear. The deputy director's expression darkened. "Excuse me," Warner said, rising abruptly. The moment the door closed, Earl's hand moved to his chest pocket, confirming the Zippo lighter was still there. 30 minutes since they'd taken him from the farm. If Petrov had made it to the ridge on schedule, he would already be on his way to the rendezvous point, the abandoned church in Carson's Creek where Earl's contact waited. Earl's involvement wasn't random chance as the agencies believed. Vietnam had taught him that the most effective operative was the one nobody suspected. For 20 years, Earl Whitaker had been exactly that, a sleeper asset for a shadow division of military intelligence so deeply classified that even the CIA didn't know of its existence. Unit 773, dedicated to preventing escalations that could lead to nuclear conflict. His handler, Captain Eliza Hayes, on paper, just a regional insurance adjuster who occasionally bought eggs from his roadside stand, had activated him yesterday after satellite imagery captured Petrov's crash. 2 decades of dormancy ended with a simple code phrase delivered while examining his damaged fences. "Looks like rain coming from the east." Warner returned, flanked by 2 agents whose body language spoke of heightened alert. "There's been a development," Warner said, voice carefully controlled. "The device you gave us is a decoy." Earl allowed genuine surprise to show on his face. "That's what he gave me. Our team at your farm discovered traces of an actual quantum storage device destroyed in your kitchen, deliberately." Earl's weathered face betrayed nothing, though inwardly he cursed. They'd found the remnants sooner than expected. "The Russian must have switched them," Earl offered. Warner snapped his fingers, and one of the agents produced a tablet showing thermal imaging footage grainy, but clear enough to show Earl activating the stove just before the electromagnetic pulse hit. "You've made a grave mistake, Mr. Whitaker, one that constitutes treason against the United States." Earl met Warner's gaze steadily. "Way I see it, I prevented both sides from getting a weapon that shouldn't exist. My son died for this country, Mr. Warner. I didn't destroy that thing to harm America. I did it to protect it." Warner leaned forward. The technology wasn't a weapon. It was defensive, a shield against Russian aggression. "That's not what the pilot told me." "And you believed a Russian operative over your own government." Earl's voice hardened. "I believed the evidence of my own eyes. That boy was willing to die to keep that technology from being used by anyone." A tense silence filled the room, broken by the arrival of another agent who handed Warner a phone. The deputy director listened, his face revealing nothing. "Change of plans," he announced after hanging up. "We're moving Mr. Whitaker immediately." "Where to?" Earl asked. "A more secure facility for enhanced debriefing." The euphemism wasn't lost on Earl. Enhanced debriefing meant interrogation, the kind that happened off the books. His window of opportunity was closing fast. The convoy departed 10 minutes later, 2 SUVs, Earl and the trailing vehicle sandwiched between agents. As they merged onto I-80 westbound, Earl noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The driver had Slavic features, and a small tattoo on his wrist partially visible beneath his cuff, the distinctive mark of Russian military intelligence. The Americans had been compromised. Earl's mind raced. The second SUV ahead contained Warner and his security team. Did they realize their perimeter had been breached? The Russian driver caught Earl's eye in the rearview mirror, a slight nod confirming what Earl already suspected. The vehicle had been redirected. "We should be heading east," one of the agents said, looking up from his phone. "These aren't the coordinates." The driver's hand moved in a blur, a suppressed pistol appearing as if by magic. The 2 shots were nearly silent, both agents slumping instantly in their seats. Earl remained perfectly still as the driver spoke into a concealed microphone in Russian, then switched to accented English. "Earl Whitaker, we know what you did, the question is why. Same reason your boy Petrov stole that key. Some weapons shouldn't exist." The driver nodded thoughtfully. "A principled stand, admirable if foolish. Where is Petrov now?" "I have no idea. We separated during the firefight." "Yet you managed to destroy the encryption key first. Convenient." Earl shrugged. "He told me what would happen if either side got hold of it." The SUV exited the highway onto a secluded service road. Through the window, Earl could see the first vehicle continuing on the interstate, unaware they'd lost their tail. "My superiors believe you know more than you're saying, Mr. Whitaker, about Petrov, about what else he might have shared." The Zippo felt heavier in Earl's pocket. "I'm an old farmer who got caught in something bigger than himself." The Russian smiled thinly. "No, you're something else entirely. Your actions were too precise, too effective. The timing of the electromagnetic pulse, the destruction of the key, you had help." The vehicle stopped in a wooded area, isolated from the highway. The driver turned fully, gun trained casually on Earl. "We intercepted communications. American military intelligence activated a sleeper asset in your region just before Petrov's crash. Asset code name, Scarecrow." Earl's pulse quickened, but decades of practice kept his expression neutral. They knew about his activation, but not his identity. "I don't know anything about that." "I think you do." The Russian's eyes were cold. "In fact, I think you're Scarecrow." Before Earl could respond, the SUV's window exploded inward. The Russian driver jerked violently, then slumped over the steering wheel. Outside, a figure approached, Captain Hayes, sniper rifle in hand. "You're 4 minutes behind schedule, Scarecrow," she said, opening the door. "I was getting worried." Earl carefully stepped over the dead Russian, ran into some complications. "I noticed." Hayes surveyed the 2 dead agents with professional detachment. "Warner's team will realize they've lost you soon. We need to move." "They know about Scarecrow." Hayes froze momentarily. "How much?" "Enough to be dangerous, not enough to identify me specifically." She nodded grimly. "That complicates things. Get in my car. We need to reach the rendezvous before Petrov tries to move on his own." As they drove, Hayes briefed Earl on the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Both sides think the other has the encryption key. The Russians believe the CIA extraction was a cover to secure the technology. The Americans think the Russian strike team successfully recovered it during the farm assault. And neither side knows it's destroyed." "Correct, which means they're both preparing contingencies based on the assumption the other has an advantage." Hayes's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Moscow has put their strategic forces on heightened alert. Pentagon's doing the same." Earl absorbed this with growing alarm. Over one component of an unproven weapons system. Project Blacklight isn't what either side has been claiming. Hayes took a sharp turn onto a dirt road. "The system doesn't just enable first strike capability, it completely neutralizes retaliatory options. It would make mutually assured destruction obsolete." The implications hit Earl like a physical blow. A single country could launch a nuclear attack without fear of consequences. "Now you understand why Unit 773 has been tracking this for years, and why Petrov risked everything to prevent it from being activated." They drove in silence for several miles, the Nebraska landscape flashing past in a blur of cornfields and open sky. Earl thought of his farm, likely a smoking ruin by now. Generations of family history reduced to collateral damage in a shadow war most Americans would never know existed. Hayes seemed to read his thoughts. "We'll make this right, Earl, after it's over." Earl nodded, knowing some losses couldn't be undone. "The microfilm in my lighter, will it be enough?" combined with Petrov's testimony and the technical schematics he memorized. Yes, enough to expose both programs, theirs and ours. The abandoned church appeared on the horizon, a simple white steeple rising above the plains, long since forgotten by the congregation that had built it. As they approached, Earl noticed something wrong. "Stop," he said sharply. "Hayes, hit the brakes. What is it?" "The side door is open, and those tire tracks are fresh." Hayes pulled out binoculars, scanning the building. No movement inside. Could be Petrov arrived early. Or someone found him first. Hayes reached into the back seat, producing a tactical vest and sidearm. "Plan B, then. I take point, you follow at 20 yards. If anything happens to me, your priority is the microfilm and Petrov, in that order." Earl checked the pistol, a Beretta M9 standard military issue. "Understood." They approached cautiously, using the overgrown cemetery as cover. The church had been abandoned for decades, its paint peeling and windows boarded, but the structure remained sound. As they neared the open side door, Earl detected the metallic scent of blood. Hayes signaled him to hold position while she slipped inside. Long seconds passed before her voice called softly, "Clear, but we have a situation." Earl entered to find Petrov propped against the altar, alive but barely. Fresh bandages covered wounds that hadn't been there when they'd separated. Someone had tortured him before leaving him to die. "They came, before your contact," Petrov gasped, recognizing Earl. "Wagner Group, not official Russian forces, mercenaries." Hayes was already working to stabilize him, field medical kit open beside her. "What did you tell them?" "That the key was destroyed, that we had evidence to expose the program." Blood bubbled at the corner of Petrov's mouth, internal bleeding. "They didn't believe me about the key." Earl knelt beside the dying man. "The microfilm is secure. We'll finish what you started." Petrov's eyes focused with sudden clarity. "Not so simple now. They've accelerated the launch sequence using the two existing keys. The system, partial but functional, strike package prepared." Hayes went rigid. "Timeline." 6 hours. Test demonstration on uninhabited target. Petrov coughed violently. "But there's more. American response package authorized under Operation Stillwater. Pentagon believes Russians have full system capability." Earl and Hayes exchanged alarmed glances. Stillwater was a classified counterforce protocol, a limited nuclear response to neutralize Russian strategic assets. "We're looking at reciprocal strikes," Earl said quietly, "even with a partial system." "Yes," Petrov confirmed. "Both sides preparing attack packages based on faulty intelligence. The demonstration will trigger American response. Escalation inevitable." Hayes stood abruptly. "We need to get this intelligence to command immediately." "Won't be enough," Petrov whispered. "Need to prevent the demonstration launch. The facility." He fumbled inside his flight suit, producing a small paper map with coordinates. "Blacklight control station, remote location, minimal personnel." Earl studied the map. The facility was in northern Mongolia, isolated, deniable. "With the third key destroyed, system capability is reduced," Petrov continued. "Vulnerable to certain countermeasures." He reached for Hayes's field kit, extracting a pen to scrawl a series of numbers on the map. "Override sequence. Will temporarily disable remaining network protection. One-time use." Hayes's expression was grave. "You're suggesting a direct intervention." "Only option now." Petrov's breathing grew more labored. "I can provide authentication to access the facility, but you need someone who understands the system architecture." Earl looked at the dying Russian pilot, a man who had sacrificed everything to prevent a global catastrophe. "You're not going to make it to Mongolia." "No," Petrov managed a weak smile, "but I'm not the only one who knows the system." 3 hours later, Earl found himself on a military transport aircraft headed west across the Pacific. Beside him sat a handcuffed woman in her 40s, Dr. Catherine Chen, the American physicist who had helped design Project Blacklight's quantum interface before discovering its true purpose and attempting to sabotage the program. The extraction from federal custody had been Hayes's operation, a precision raid on a black site where Chen was being held under the pretense of national security violations. With Unit 773's clearance and the evidence Earl carried, they had secured provisional authority for the mission, though Earl harbored no illusions about what would happen if they failed. "You understand what we're attempting is likely suicide," Earl said to Chen as the aircraft banked over the international date line. The physicist nodded, eyes fixed on the technical schematics Hayes had provided. "And if we do nothing, millions die. Not much of a choice." Earl studied her, brilliant, determined, and carrying the same burden of conscience that had driven Petrov to defect. "Why did you help develop it in the first place?" "We were told it was purely defensive, a shield against hypersonic weapons." Bitterness crept into her voice. "By the time I realized the quantum tunneling effect could be reversed to create an offensive system, it was too late. They compartmentalized everything after that." The aircraft began its descent toward a remote airfield in northern Japan, the last friendly territory before they would transfer to a smaller plane with stealth capabilities. Hayes approached from the cockpit. "Intel update," she said grimly. "Russian demonstration launch has been moved up. New window is 90 minutes from now." Earl felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "And Stillwater?" "On automatic response protocol. The moment Russian launch is detected, American birds fly." Hayes handed him a satellite phone. "Secure channel to Unit 773 Command. They're attempting to get the president to stand down Stillwater, but the Pentagon is pushing hard. They believe this is their only chance to neutralize Blacklight before it's fully operational, even though it risks nuclear exchange. The military assessment is that with only partial Blacklight capability, Russian coverage is incomplete. A precisely targeted American first strike could theoretically eliminate their launch capabilities with acceptable damage parameters." Chen laughed bitterly. "Acceptable damage parameters. That's what we call millions of civilian casualties now." The aircraft touched down with a jolt, taxiing quickly to a camouflaged hangar where a sleek, dark plane waited, unmarked, with the distinctive profile of an advanced stealth aircraft. "Final equipment check," Hayes ordered as they transferred planes. "We'll be crossing into contested airspace in 30 minutes. After that, we're on our own until mission complete." Earl inspected his tactical gear, lightweight body armor, communications equipment, sidearm, and the specialized toolkit Chen had requested. Standard field equipment for Unit 773 operations, though it had been 20 years since he deployed with a full kit. As they boarded the stealth aircraft, Hayes pulled Earl aside. "You know this is beyond what we activated you for, Scarecrow. Last chance to stand down." Earl thought of his farm, of Margaret, of his son who never came home, of Petrov, who had given his life for a principle bigger than national interests. "Some things are worth dying for, Captain, always have been." Hayes nodded, something like respect flickering in her eyes. "For what it's worth, your service record says you were one of the best we ever had." "Let's hope I haven't lost my touch." The smaller aircraft lifted off, its engines surprisingly quiet, heading northwest toward Mongolia and the Blacklight control station, and quite possibly the end of Earl Whitaker's long and unexpected journey. The facility was exactly where Petrov's coordinates had indicated, a windowless concrete structure built into the side of a remote mountain, disguised as a weather monitoring station. From their vantage point half a kilometer away, Earl could see minimal external security, 2 guards at the entrance, basic perimeter fencing, and surveillance cameras. "Deceptively simple," Chen whispered as they observed through binoculars. "The real security is inside, biometric scanners, pressure-sensitive flooring, and automated defense systems. "Can we bypass them?" Hayes asked. Chen nodded. "With Petrov's authentication codes and the override sequence, yes, but timing is critical. The override creates a 90-second window before the secondary systems activate." Earl checked his watch. 43 minutes until scheduled launch. Hayes made the call. "We go now. Standard infiltration protocol. Chen in the middle, Earl on rear guard." They moved swiftly across the rocky terrain, using natural cover where possible. The guards at the entrance were neutralized silently, tranquilizer darts rather than lethal force, a Unit 773 standard operating procedure to minimize international incidents. Chen approached the entry panel, attaching a specialized device to the interface, uploading Petrov's biometric signature. "Now." The door hissed open. Inside, red emergency lighting cast eerie shadows down sterile corridors. "They're on launch protocol," Chen explained. "Minimal personnel, automated systems handling most functions." They encountered no resistance as they moved deeper into the facility, following Chen's directions toward the central control room. Too easy, Earl thought, his decades of operational experience setting off warning bells. His instincts proved correct as they rounded the final corner. The control room entrance was guarded by 4 armed security personnel, not regular soldiers, but the distinctive tactical gear of Wagner Group mercenaries. Hayes signaled for them to fall back, but it was too late. One of the guards spotted them, shouting in Russian as all 4 raised their weapons. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Hayes pushed Chen behind a support column, opening fire with her suppressed weapon. Earl dropped to one knee, acquiring targets with the fluid efficiency that had once made him one of Unit 773's most effective operators. 2 mercenaries fell immediately. The third managed to trigger an alarm before Hayes's shot found its mark. The 4th disappeared through the control room door, sealing it behind him. "Breach protocol," Hayes shouted, already moving toward the sealed door with explosive charges. Chen rushed forward with her override device. "Wait, if we damage the door controls, the secondary systems lock down completely." While Hayes covered them, Chen worked the panel, muttering calculations under her breath. Earl kept watch on their rear, knowing reinforcements would be coming. 28 minutes to launch, he reminded them. "Almost there," Chen replied, fingers flying across the device. "Petrov's sequence is being accepted, but there's additional encryption I didn't anticipate." The sound of boots on metal flooring echoed from a connecting corridor. Earl positioned himself at the intersection, calculating angles and fields of fire. "We've got company," he warned. "Multiple hostiles approaching fast." Hayes made a quick decision. "Earl, hold them off. Chen, you have 2 minutes to get that door open, then we move to Plan B." Earl didn't need to ask what Plan B entailed. The small tactical nuclear device in Hayes's pack, a last resort to destroy the facility if they couldn't disable the launch sequence. A desperate measure that would almost certainly trigger the very war they were trying to prevent. The first mercenaries rounded the corner and Earl engaged. His shots were precise, economical, the product of training so deeply ingrained it transcended age and time away from the field. One by one, the attackers fell back or dropped entirely, creating a bottleneck in the narrow corridor. Behind him, Chen exclaimed triumphantly as the control room door slid open. "I'm in." Hayes moved immediately, neutralizing the final mercenary inside before he could react. Earl backed toward them, still covering the corridor as Chen rushed to the main console. 17 minutes, Hayes announced, securing the door behind them. The control room was a marvel of advanced technology, holographic displays showing orbital trajectories, launch vectors, and system status indicators. Chen worked with focused intensity, interfacing her device with the main system. The demonstration target is verified, she said grimly. Uninhabited island in the Pacific, but the American response is already primed. Their satellites will detect the launch immediately. Earl kept one eye on the external camera feeds, showing more mercenaries arriving outside the facility. How long to abort the launch? That's the problem, Chen replied, frustration evident. I can't abort it directly. The authorization requires 2 physical keys, both already inserted and verified. But her eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. I can redirect it. Hayes looked up sharply. Redirect where? The upper atmosphere. If I can alter the trajectory to detonate high enough, it becomes a simple EMP event over an empty ocean area. Detectable but non-threatening. Will the Americans recognize it as non-aggressive? Earl asked. If they're monitoring closely enough, yes. And with the evidence you're carrying, your Unit 773 should be able to confirm our intervention. Hayes made the call. Do it. Chen's fingers flew across the interface, making adjustments and bypassing security protocols. On the main display, the trajectory line gradually shifted upward. 10 minutes to launch, the automated system announced in Russian. A new alarm sounded, different from the security alert. Chen's expression turned to horror. They've initiated remote override. Someone's trying to reset the targeting coordinates. Hayes was immediately at her side. Can you block it? Temporarily, but they're using quantum encryption to. Chen stopped abruptly, understanding dawning. The missing third key. That's why they couldn't fully activate the system. Without it, their access is limited. Earl reached into his pocket, producing the Zippo lighter. Will this help? Chen stared at the microfilm hidden inside. The evidence? I don't see how. Not just evidence, Earl explained. Petrov didn't just document the project. He included the quantum signature algorithms for the third key, not the key itself, but enough data to simulate its quantum state. Understanding lit Chen's face. That could work. If I can extract the algorithms and create a virtual key, I can lock them out completely. 7 minutes to launch. Hayes made a split-second decision. Do it, but keep working on the trajectory adjustments simultaneously. Earl, help me barricade that door. They'll be coming with heavier equipment soon. As Chen worked frantically, Hayes and Earl reinforced the entrance with everything movable in the control room. Through the security feeds, they could see the mercenaries preparing breaching charges. 5 minutes to launch. How's that virtual key coming? Hayes called over her shoulder. Almost there, Chen replied, scanning the microfilm through an optical reader on her device. The quantum signatures are complex, but Petrov was thorough. The first explosion rocked the door but didn't breach it. The second would be positioned more effectively. 3 minutes to launch. Chen shouted triumphantly. Got it, virtual key activated. The main display flickered, then stabilized with a new status. Administrator override accepted. Remote access TRMINATED. And the trajectory? Earl asked. Locked in. Detonation point set at 300 kilometers altitude over the Pacific. No direct damage, minimal EMP effect on shipping lanes. 2 minutes to launch. Hayes moved to the communication station. I need to contact Unit 773 immediately. They need to alert the Pentagon about the non-hostile nature of the launch. As Hayes established the secure connection, a final explosion breached the door partially. Gunfire sprayed through the opening, forcing Earl and Chen to take cover. 1 minute to launch. Earl returned fire, creating cover for Hayes as she relayed critical information to her command. Authorization Scarecrow Delta. Operation Castle complete. Blacklight demonstration redirected to high-altitude Pacific detonation. Not repeat, not hostile action. Stillwater must stand down immediately. 30 seconds to launch. The door gave way further. Earl took a round to his shoulder but maintained his position, protecting Chen and Hayes as they completed their vital work. Launch sequence initiated. On the monitors, they watched as the missile rose from a hidden silo elsewhere in the complex, streaking into the clear Mongolian sky. Missile trajectory confirmed, Chen announced. It's on the modified flight path. Hayes received confirmation through her headset. Command acknowledges. Pentagon alerted. Satellite confirmation of trajectory underway. The mercenaries made a final push into the control room. Earl's weapon clicked empty, and he switched to his sidearm, knowing they were seconds from being overrun. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Detonation confirmed. The main display showed a brief, brilliant flash high above the Pacific, a harmless firecracker compared to what could have been. Simultaneously, Hayes received the transmission they'd been praying for. Stillwater stood down. Repeat, Stillwater response package stood down. In that moment of victory, a final burst of gunfire tore through the control room. Earl felt the impact as 3 rounds struck his chest, the body armor absorbing most but not all of the force. He fell back, returning fire on instinct and dropping the lead mercenary. Hayes eliminated the remaining attackers with clinical precision, then rushed to Earl's side. Blood spread across his tactical vest, but his eyes remained clear. "Did we do it?" he asked, voice weaker than he'd have liked. "We did it," Hayes confirmed. Nuclear exchange averted, both sides standing down. The evidence is already being processed through diplomatic channels. Chen joined them, applying pressure to Earl's wounds. Medical evacuation is inbound, 20 minutes out. Earl nodded, strangely at peace despite the pain. Not bad for an old farmer. Hayes managed a smile. One hell of a final mission, Scarecrow. As consciousness began to fade, Earl thought about his farm, about the generations of Whitakers who had worked that land, about Margaret and Michael and all they had sacrificed, and about Petrov, who had given everything to prevent a war that now would never happen. Some victories, Earl reflected, were measured not in what happened but in what didn't. 1 year later. The farmhouse looked almost exactly as it had before, weather-beaten but sturdy, standing resilient against the Nebraska sky. Earl sat on the newly rebuilt porch, watching the sun set over fields that had been resown after the firefight that had nearly destroyed everything. Captain Hayes, now Colonel Hayes, pulled up the long driveway in an unmarked car, exactly as she had done dozens of times when posing as an insurance adjuster. Today there was no pretense needed. "The crops are coming in nicely," she observed, taking a seat beside him. "Good year for corn," Earl agreed. "How's Washington?" "Complicated. The Joint U.S.-Russian Commission on Orbital Weapons Systems is making progress. Both sides have agreed to full dismantlement of their respective programs." She handed him a folder. Project Blacklight officially never existed, of course. Of course, Earl didn't bother opening the folder, and Chen. "Consulting for the verification team. Her expertise has proven invaluable." Hayes paused. "Petrov received his recognition posthumously. The Russian government officially lists him as having died in a training accident, but his family was quietly compensated." Earl nodded, satisfied. "And Unit 773? Still operating, still preventing the unthinkable." Hayes smiled slightly. "They asked me to check if you'd consider coming on as a training consultant. Apparently being shot 3 times and still completing the mission makes you something of a legend." Earl chuckled, wincing slightly at the pain that still lingered in his chest. "Think I'll stick to farming, getting too old for saving the world." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors deepen across the Nebraska sky, the same sky that might have been filled with nuclear fire if events had unfolded differently. "You know," Hayes said finally, "most operatives never get to see the results of their work. The disasters that don't happen, the wars that never start, there's no parade for those victories." Earl thought about the microfilm that had helped avert catastrophe, about Petrov's sacrifice, about all the unnamed individuals who had played their parts in preventing the unthinkable. Some victories, he said quietly, are best measured in sunsets. Far above them, a commercial airliner traced its path across the darkening sky, ordinary people going about ordinary lives, never knowing how close they had come to losing everything, or how much had been sacrificed to protect them. Earl Whitaker, farmer and spy, raised his coffee mug in a silent toast, to Petrov, to the victories no one would ever know about, and to the simple privilege of watching one more Nebraska sunset. If you appreciated this story, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and leaving a comment below. Every week, we bring you immersive stories that explore the extraordinary moments hidden within ordinary lives.